All right. I violated the first rule of BDE, the black shirt.
Oh, the black.
I'm the floating head.
That's not the first rule.
What's the first rule? What's that?
Make sure you're.
Oh, make sure you
not
pee.
squirming.
Make sure you pee before you talk. Yeah, that's the number one rule of life. That's not a BDE specific. What?
We're not starting off with oil.
But
we will. But we will talk about it.
There we go. Fair enough. Yeah. So I figured oil would come up. But.
So what do we got to open the thing up?
All right. Peak Resources filed to go public. It's a Yorktown-backed company. Jack Vaughn leads it. Pure play in the Powder River Basin. Let's just wander down the list. Valuations are at all-time
just to level set. They filed on the 20th of last month, I believe, and announced that they're launching the IPO today. So that was out. War 527 shared that this morning. That's why it caught my attention.
Gotcha. So it's, all-time worst valuations, or certainly poor valuations, a lot of volatility out in the market. Still, capital availability is better, but it's certainly not where it was.
And I think Wyoming kind of fits in that bucket of Western states. Maybe not Colorado level. We're seeing pretty significant political and regulatory headwinds in terms of development and expansion.
So, and when I think of the underwriters in the energy business, I don't necessarily think of Janney Montgomery, and I don't mean to disparage any investment bank. I'm grateful for any investment bank that'll work with energy companies, but so, what's going on? I think this is one of those things where there's something going on, we just don't know about it. I started to read the S1 and kind of put me to sleep. It was not that it's not an exciting story or anything, but just, all the different funds that are in things. And, so you kind of have the Yorktown's probably been in there for a long time. If you have a S1 available, that's always your sales memo. Hey, everybody, we're for sale. Please make us an offer. The other thing you can do is when you're publicly traded, you can then take your shares and distribute it out to your investors if you're Yorktown. And you kind of have to do that just because funds get long in the tooth and people are like, hey, where's our money? And
there's only so many fund extensions.
There's only so many fund extensions you can get. Investors are pesky that way. They like their money back, and who knows? I've met Jack. I had a meeting with him like 15 years ago. I think he showed me his picture of him going to I think he's been to the peak of Mount Everest. And
cool.
He had a little golf club he took up there and he hit a golf ball off it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, who knows? Maybe he's always wanted to run a public company. But I do think I can't make a compelling case for why they're doing it. I will say it's going to be interesting to see the feedback.
I want to say that the target is a little over 86 million. Their fair market value, I think, as of June 30th was around 395 million. And I saw in that quick scan that is about 1,800 gross locations. So, this is maybe trying to hit the ATM a little bit.
Yeah.
When was the last one we saw like this?
So the last IPO I remember is Tamboran, who was Brian Sheffield's Beetaloo Basin. You had Citibank get them public in, when was that? August, September?
Yeah, it was recent.
But again, but there you kind of had a niche play. You'd had enough capital invested that you de-risked a play. It has a possibility of being huge. That kind of felt like a unique story that even if public markets are tough, you can get unique stories done. So we'll see what happens on peak. It'll be interesting.
It looked like peak's revenue at June 30th on a year-over-year basis was down something on the order of 12%. So,
did you see what kind of oil versus gas split they had?
No.
Yeah. So,
speaking of oil,
all right, we got to go back. Kirk's not here to save me.
More of the $3, $4, and $5 moves on, I think, how headlines are written. So the IEA is out today talking about 2024 demand being revised down by 40,000 barrels a day, which is maybe not rounding on the margin. It matters. Certainly the optics matter. But also, and I didn't see where they took their 2025 number, increasing that, obviously off of a lower 2024 base that they adjusted here on October the 15th. So honing in on the answer
right
for 2024 demand, China weakness, the thing that we've heard and seen repeatedly in these headlines. Also taking the opportunity to address this looming question about whether or not Iran's oil infrastructure is at risk from an Israeli response, which, there's back and forth headlines every day, multiple times a day. And really what the IEA said, we've got 1.2 billion barrels in global stocks in the OECD. We don't expect a supply disruption, but if it happens, ensuring that they will then take action, whatever that is, to alleviate any of that supply side disruption and potential upward crisis of an upward spike in prices. And also took the opportunity to remind everybody that OPEC Plus has multiple million barrels off the market right now. So I think if you take this as a definitive, we don't know what Israel's going to do. As we've discussed, we've had people a lot smarter than at least I am about the real time goings on in terms of what the Israeli response is going to be and how that affects. It's just this headline yo-yo of a couple of factors and a couple of pretty high profile voices making the headlines.
And I think the CBS report last week was an anonymous source said, so, and that was the $5 down on, was it Friday that it was down?
And with an election 3 weeks from today.
Yeah. It is an interesting dilemma for Israel because you want to penalize the regime, but not the people.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, I do think the Iranian people, if they ever had a democratically elected government, would actually be pro-West. I mean, we've talked about that a few times on here. So you don't want to hamper their ability to have a constructive, democratically elected government. And if you take out nuclear power plants, and you take out oil and the possibility of oil revenues from Iran, that makes that really difficult. So
and Mark Rossano did a good job of breaking all of those dimensions down a few weeks ago. There's precision and targeted have been so far the Israeli MO. So but if anyone has precisely the scope and magnitude of the Israeli response definitively figured out, I'd take that with a huge grain of salt. But the oil markets are reacting to. It's interesting when you have a looming response, yet you've got rhetoric about a slight cut in demand for 24, and then, hey, we're going to backstop it with global inventories, which are seasonally and within the 5-year average is low. The reaction is pretty fiercely negative. I think I woke up this morning, crude was down $5, firmly in the 6-handle territory. It's recaptured some of that. So stay tuned for more of the same.
There we go.
Which makes, any kind of sustained strength and equities despite their valuation and how compelling it is. And he kind of sustained, I think I saw a meme this morning, retail investors or generalist investors piling into oil and gas stocks in October, and it was like this blast through a fence right in the face. So we'll have to find that if we can.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we do need oil to close at 69.69. I mean,
no comment.
All right. I did not have on my bingo card when we woke up this morning that we'd possibly be talking about the Nigerian grid. I will even admit I didn't know they had a grid. I'm assuming they did.
But. They do. And this isn't the first time this year. In fact, it's grid collapse number 6. And the way I read it, that collapse means generation goes to zero. So country went completely dark. And I saw there were some facilities that were generation facilities that were starting to come back online this morning. This is kind of part of their ambient condition. There's my favorite word again.
Condition.
I was just interested to kind of gee whiz some of the statistics, the profile of Nigeria. It's 75%. Its grid is 75% thermal generation. Yet they have cited a pinch of gas availability, which is somewhat ironic in that Nigeria is the 17th ranked global producer of natural gas, and I didn't have time to do the conversion, but 44 billion cubic meters per year, of which they export via LNG 17 billion cubic meters per year. Obviously, there's a lot of gas in Nigeria,
right?
A lot of oil too, and it speaks to the just the fatal flaws in a decrepit grid.
Yeah, that
you can't keep or you can't improve reliability. Certainly based just on generation and generation potential. I think there's certainly enough fuel resources to keep a grid that's 75% thermal online in a country that's as resource rich as Nigeria. But the other factors that come into play, you have a lot of really sabotage through piracy,
vandalism,
illegal taps into the electrical grids in some metropolitan areas, and so
as well as just pure out thievery. Let's go steal it and we'll sell it to somebody else on the black market.
I don't know what the amount of diesel that's consumed. I have a former colleague who is Nigerian, and he talked about, he lives in London, but he talked about what he has to do at his house and his father have to do. You have to have a tremendous amount of diesel backup generation capacity because these grid failures do happen quite frequently. I mean, 6 in a year. I don't know where that compares for the last few years, but it sounds like, enough to be more than a hardship. But if you have the equipment and the means, it's an expensive backup generation option, and it is used quite a bit. But the vast majority of folks can't afford to have that capability.
It's weird. We're going to go Charles Dickens on it, but best of times, worst of times. When you look at grids, we are so spoiled. I mean, our lights go off and our air conditioning goes off and we throw a huge fit, but that's a hurricane once a year, maybe twice a year type thing. As we've had, the CEO of Centerpoint's potentially going to get fired for, being down twice this year because of the tornado or whatever we called that. And then the hurricane. That being said, I mean, we almost had a collapse under Winter Storm Uri. The story was we were 20 minutes away from it. So even with all the modern technology that we have, this shit's just really hard.
And
it's
we
hard
have
to run a grid.
We have made all that grid choreography because supply has to meet demand instantaneously on the grid. We've just made that more complex and more complicated by the addition or changing the gen stack.
Yeah.
With solar and wind and, building an ever growing capacity for storage. I think Texas is now 7 gigawatts of storage.
Yeah.
And when I look at the ERCOT real time stats and the distribution across the gen stack, it's maybe I just catch it at the wrong time. It's usually kind of the discharging power storage is usually mostly a non-meaningful to 1% contributor to what the generation contribution is at this point in time. I don't really know where we're headed in terms of that capacity, but trying to get everything lined out while still being exposed to extreme conditions, both heat and storms and cold, is, something that's rare for us, as you pointed out. But imagine being like Nigeria and having it happen multiple times a year where there's an absolute 100% collapse.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, interesting to watch, and hopefully we can learn from lessons. I also didn't have this on my bingo card this morning, talking about Malaysia and data centers. And then we'll close with my favorite topic du jour of recent nukes. But anyway, this is pretty interesting because I think I went and hung out with Brian Sheffield in Australia, went through the Beetaloo Basin. I
think I heard something about that trip.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what tomorrow's Chuck Yates Needs a Job podcast is going to be? I'm just going to put together all the clips we've released so far from Brian, just to kind of intro that. And then the next week, Brian had dinner with a traditional owner who's starting an oil service company in Australia. We're going to just release that dinner. We just had the camera sitting in the corner running on dinner. I found it so fascinating. I'm just going to release that because I think people will like that. But so Brian was coming from Europe. I was coming from America. And so when you come from Europe, you go in through Singapore to the Northern Territory. When you come from America, you go in through Sydney. Well, I just said, screw it, and flew an extra 4 hours and went to Singapore because I'd never been there. And anyway, it was cool. It was cool to go see cleanest city I think I've ever been in, except maybe Helsinki is cleaner. But it was fascinating because, it was modern, all that, did the food and everything else. Also, you could get the vibe that it was incredibly expensive. I mean, the Sands Hotel was through the roof.
It's all of that. I spent some time there, pretty significant time traveling through the region when I was an expat years ago. And I always recall one of I guess it's really was a precursor to memes, but it was a t-shirt that on the front had Singapore as a fine country. And then on the back, it was all the red circles with the red line through it, fine for spitting, fine for chewing gum, fine for, of course, there was a pretty famous case from an American teenager who was actually caned for vandalism back in I think it was the late 90s. And yes, it's an incredibly clean and certainly well-run city-state. My favorite zoo in the world, just as an aside.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, and I need to
seeing a 21-foot crocodile up close is, and at feeding time was pretty.
Well, this was funny because Laura has a good friend that lives in Singapore, and I won't say any names, but anyway, Laura's like, "Hey, my boyfriend's coming over. What does he need to go see?" And it turns out her friend wasn't going to be in Singapore, or we would have gone and grabbed a drink or something. And the friend comes back with, the hawker stands, to go get the food. You need to go see this. You need to go see this. And said, by the way, you got to leave the edibles and any marijuana at home because it's a capital offense. But don't worry, prostitution's legal. And I'm like, why are you sending me a email about prostitution being legal on a thread with Laura? But anyway.
So our security officer, I was living and working in Karachi of all places, and used to tell us if we were traveling through Singapore, make sure you always had brand new currency. You don't want stuff that's been rolled up.
Oh, I wouldn't have even thought of that.
They're pretty quick about it. At least, the cases that I remember where there was drugs found on tourists at immigration that, within a few days you go in front of a judge, and if there's a summary judgment against you, then the capital punishment's carried out within a few days.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's changed, but it was, I used to say, because of all the retail centers and around the hotels that we would stay in for a couple of days, coming from Karachi, going to Singapore, which is, the alpha and omega in terms of just kind of the urban experience.
Right.
I'll just leave it at that. And it was, I said it, it's like going to the mall.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And it is really expensive real estate. So getting back to the data center connection.
Well, the last thing, so the Sands Hotel, which basically has the ship-looking thing up on the 55th floor connecting the 3 different towers, has a swimming pool. The swimming pool literally just has an edge, and you look over the edge.
What floor?
Like 55. So you're up there. I'm scared of heights, so I didn't go over to it. But like, and the edge of the pool is like at your waist. It's not super high, And anyway, but sitting in that pool, I saw Citibank, I saw JP Morgan, literally all the financial powerhouses of the world, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, they were all there. And so you just know that this has as much fiber conductivity as any other place on the planet.
Sure. And that's, Malaysia shares a border with Singapore on the peninsula. And I think the Singapore legacy is, for all the reasons that you've outlined, it's been a growing hub of data center activity. It just caught my eye, a little bit familiar with Malaysia, lived in Kuala Lumpur for a bit. And one of my first observations was, when they decide to build something infrastructure wise, I think the Goodwill games were coming some years ago when I was there, and there were just massive public infrastructure projects, not the least of which was an overhead rail that just popped up within a very short period of time and was mostly completed, to be a permanent part of the infrastructure of KL, but was built with the catalyst of the Goodwill Games being hosted there. And if you go to KL, you'll just be struck by, there's been a lot of really recent and major spending on infrastructure, capital infrastructure improvements. So this angle in terms of the data center development, one, land is much cheaper in Malaysia than it is across the border in Singapore. And then you've got a pretty committed public support. They have something called the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint, and they want to go from, I don't know where they rank today from a hosting standpoint, but they want to go to, I would infer, top 3 to 5 within the next 5 years.
Yeah.
And so, evidenced by the fact that just among Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and NVIDIA, there's either proposed or committed projects of a combined $15 billion. And I thought, well, Malaysia's long been known as an oil and gas, pretty heavy gas province. You remember Murphy had their big deepwater developments offshore Malaysia that really made it a boutique stock or a really
Right.
niche story among the then integrateds. But I just looked at just their quick power statistics from the latest that's available. They generate 82, or they use 82. Sorry, let me back up. 76 terawatt hours come from coal, and 68 terawatt hours from gas, and only 4 terawatt hours from renewables. The country now, it's been kind of marginally growing on the oil and gas side from a production standpoint. Produces about 600,000 barrels a day of oil and about 82 billion cubic meters per day of gas. So the notion that, there's momentum and urgency accelerating to get these major data center operations sited and started, built, I think we can see those following pretty heavy along the thermal generation route.
Yeah, and it's an international game, Yeah,
and you're proximal to a major existing hub in Singapore, and certainly with good geographic proximity to China.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings us to our final story. My kind of issue du jour, but Google announced they're going to buy power for their AI needs from small modular nuclear reactor company. Is it Keros? Keros. And so, again, if you're in the natural gas business in the United States, guys, you got to figure out how to sell electrons, and you got to go straight talk to big tech because they're going to make these decisions.
Yeah, it's a total of 500 megawatts of power under this arrangement, with the projection that first online SMR would be 2030, and then they would build the rest of that out to 2035. Obviously, this is in the U.S., got the same things that we talked about when Nuclear Navy Submariner Bob Kuntz was on a few months ago. The NRC and the permitting process for any nuclear builder is, especially for the smaller ones and the innovative entrepreneurial ones, is going to face, unless something meaningfully changes in terms of the inertia that is really embedded in the NRC. And I think FERC to a lesser extent, I told someone this morning I would take the over on both 2030 and 2035, but it also points out that, when you kind of compare the Malaysia story with this, there is an urgent gap to fill between now and nuclear. And where else does that get filled from a reliability, cost, and scale standpoint? Things continue to point back to my number one draft pick, natural gas.
There you go.
I read somewhere that there was a piece out last month that really went through the major, mostly on-grid providers and where they stand with their data center agreements. There was one called Pinnacle West Capital. Not familiar with them, maybe should be. I think they've got 4 gigawatts of, I don't want to call them committed projects, but those are things that they're at least working on. Their backlog against that 4 gigawatts was 10 gigawatts. And that's one out of a long list of, the AEPs of the world, it's Constellation, et cetera. And, that's not focused on any particular generation source. The point is that what's getting penciled out here longer term is a big, big number. And I think the expectation that something gets done between now and 2030, if we optimistically believe that nuclear is going to overwhelm natural gas, it may. It just seems like the ease and clearer runway for natural gas makes it certainly a stopgap. And if companies can't get things done in the U.S., then they're going to go do things in places like Malaysia. We've seen it in LNG with the pause. Yeah. We had a couple of long-term agreements immediately on the heels of the pause that went to
Oh,
South America and I think Qatar.
Counterpoint for just a second. I'm starting to get more and more kind of favorable about the Elon Musk Secretary of Efficiency. Uh, you know, potential. Exactly. I mean, it's who knows who's going to win this presidential race and all that. But I mean, I do think the possibility of Musk coming in and Trump talking a lot about, because the one big thing you can say about Trump, you can disagree with it. You can say it's bad government, but he really did take a whacking to the regulatory environment when he was in for the 4 years. So I forgot how many pages of rules and regulations he got rid of, but it was a significant amount. And so to the extent he gets back in and comes with that, we've got a real shot. And the tech guys have lined up. The tech guys have been way more supportive of Trump this time than they were previous times. And so, again, nukes through it quicker. Okay.
I think as this builds momentum, particularly where you're directly impacting communities where these either new nuclear kind of utility scale facilities are built, and SMRs, there's going to be, I think, a resurrection. And you already see it kind of sprinkled throughout any articles that you see about the nuclear renaissance, which is we don't have a national repository for nuclear waste. And, there are things like kind of fears based upon two very high-profile incidents in the last 50 years, defined as Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, more recently Fukushima. So those things are going to get a lot of, I think, ferocity and momentum as we get down to the nitty-gritty of, okay, where are these things going to be? What are they? Let's just say we took down I'm not a nuclear engineer, don't sit on the NRC. But I think part of the issue that nuclear experts will tell you is that we have built in over time a significant amount of overdesign, which we see manifest in things like how much Vogtle, which just commissioned in Georgia, how much over budget. These aren't trivial hundreds of millions. These are multiple billions per unit. So I just think getting resolved from, there's multiple layers of permitting that have to be successfully
and
resolved.
All the lawsuits that come with it. That said, though, I still keep coming back. If big tech or big pharma wants something, they ultimately get it, and it's just going to be a different game than we play in energy that they play in tech. So
I do think the market response will be very different than if Trump wins versus Harris, for what you just pointed to in terms of regulatory reform. And I keep going back to the notion that the one that needs pretty radical reforming is the NRC.
Yeah.
And can you get that done?
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see.
And can you get it done if you're trumping in a 4-year term?
Exactly.
So
be interesting to see what happens in the Senate races. And
so how was Nashville?
Nashville's good. The daughter is enjoying her time in college. So
a resurgent SEC powerhouse, Vanderbilt Commodores.
Exactly.
Took down Kentucky this weekend.
Exactly. Got the most votes for the top 25 and not making the 25. So I guess they're number 26 in the country. And so anyway, that's great. Guys, if you enjoyed the show this week, share it with a friend. Leave us comments. We try to get there. I'm a little sensitive, so don't be mean.